네, 반갑습니다. 시간이 많지 않기 때문에 조금 간단하게 오늘 강사를 소개를 드리고 시작을 하도록 하겠습니다. 사실 더 이상 소개가 필요 없는 정말 세계적인 학자라는 말을 잘 안 쓰는데 그 표현이 결코 무색하지 않은 그런 훌륭한 신학자를 오늘 모시게 되었습니다. 우리 볼프 교수님은 삼위일체론에 대한 아주 정통한 학자이시면서 또 이분이 오랫동안 민족, 종교, 민족 이런 갈등과 또 참상, 살인 이런 것들로 인해서 굉장히 큰 고통을 겪었던 이 발칸반도에서 태어나시고 성장하시고 또 우리 볼프 교수님 아버님이 목사님이시면서 그 가운데서 굉장히 어려움을 많이 겪으셨기 때문에 상당히 이렇게 순수신학, 정통신학에 대해서도 관심이 많고 조예가 굉장히 깊으신 분이시지만 우리 볼프 교수님의 또 한편으로 굉장히 신학적인 어떤 진지한 관심이 용서, 화해 또 나쁜 상처들에 대한 기억들을 어떻게 처리할 것인가, 해결할 것인가. 그런데 그런 아주 실천적인 면에서도 제가 볼 때는 발군의 어떤 통찰력을 발휘하는 책들을 많이 쓰셨고, 또 최근에는 우리가 소위 말하는 이제 공공신학, 또 정치신학 이런 분야에서도 가장 왕성한 활동을 하시는. 그래서 우리식으로 표현하면은 요즘 가장 핫한 신학자이십니다. 그래서 사실 이렇게 모시기가 쉬운 분이 아닌데 또 오늘 통역해 주시는 차재승 교수님이 흔쾌히 또 이렇게 연결을 해주시고 배려를 해주시고 원래 우리 볼프 교수님 모시려면은 막 이렇게 굉장히 넓은 장소에서 많은 청중들을 이렇게 운집해 갖고 해야 되는데 좀 저희가 그런 면에서 환경이 불비합니다만은 거기가 또 아랑곳하지 않으시고 우리 볼프 교수님이 오셔서 강의를 해주셔서 너무 감사하고 제가 막 며칠 전부터 가슴이 막 설레이고 뛰었습니다. 그래서 오늘 강의해 주실 때 여러분들에게 많은 도전과 또 깨우침과 나아가야 될 방향을 제시해 줄 수 있는 그런 시간이 되리라고 믿고 결코 여러분들이 후회하지 않을 그런 명강의 시간이 되리라고 생각을 합니다. 이제 볼프 교수님 나오셔서 우리 강의 진행하실 때 여러분들 우리 교회에서 쓰는 말로 많은 은혜 받으시기 바랍니다.
Good evening to everyone. Good evening. I'm honored to be here with you and to be able to present this lecture to you.
여기 이렇게 올 수 있게 돼서 너무 영광이고 또 이 강의를 함께 나눌 수 있게 돼서 참 영광입니다.
I'm also thankful for the publishing house to have translated one of my very difficult books.
세계적으로 출판사가 삼일체와 교회를 출판했는데 굉장히 어려운 책을 출판해서 고맙습니다.
One of my students who now teaches at Yale thinks that this was my best book.
그 책이 제일 좋은 책이라고 생각합니다. 예에 있는 학생이 그렇게 얘기한다.
So very good choice.
좋은 선택을 하셨습니다.
The present series of lectures that I was giving, that I'm giving now here and elsewhere in Seoul, are connected with a new book that I'm working on, and which is on the nature of theology and on renewal of theology.
예, 지금 강의하는 이 강의는 원래 이제 시리즈 강의를 여러 개를 같이 하는 가운데 하나인데 앞으로 새로 출판하게 될 신학의 그 본질에 관한 새로 출판하는 9월달에 아마 나올 겁니다. 그래서 그 책의 내용입니다.
And I'm proposing that the theme of flourishing or of the good life, of the true life, should be at the center of theological endeavor.
예, 가장 중요한 주장이 이 책 속에 번영의 삶, 이제 우리 번영 신학하고 연관이 있는 게 아니고요. 분명히 다릅니다. 번역의 삶 혹은 진정한 삶, 참된 삶, 그것이 이제 우리 기독교 일의 가장 중요한 핵심적인 주제가 되어야 된다라는 그런 주장을 합니다.
And this is because I believe that the theme of flourishing is at the very center of the Christian faith.
그 이유는 이제 그 번영하는 삶이 우리 기독교 신앙의 가장 중요한 그 중앙에 위치해야 된다고 믿기 때문입니다.
The second sentence in the lecture reads like this: the flourishing of human beings along with all God's creatures in the presence of God is God's foremost concern for creation and should be the central purpose of theology.
굉장히 길게 지금 써 있는데 이제 곧 보실 겁니다. 이게 두 번째 문장에서 나올 건데 결국 같은 얘기입니다. 그 번영하는 삶, 그 진정한 삶, 그것이 이제 하나님이 계획하시는 창조 세계의 가장 중요한 핵심적인 내용이다. 그런 뜻입니다.
I think it's also the central purpose of Christian mission.
예, 기독교 선교에도 가장 선교가 이제 포괄적일 수 있죠. 기독교 선교에도 그것이 가장 중요한 가지입니다.
What I will try to do in this lecture is to sketch why the theme of flourishing is so important.
예, 지금 특별히 이 강의에서 강조할 것은 그 번영의 삶 혹은 진정한 삶이 왜 그렇게 중요한가라는 것을 이제 설명하기를 원합니다.
Why it corresponds to an important quest in the search of human beings, particularly today.
왜 오늘 같은 맥락에서 왜 그 질문이 다른 그 인간에 대한 굉장히 중요한 질문들과 서로 상응하는가에 대한 그런 얘기를 설명을 할 것입니다.
So I'll say something about what I mean by flourishing, how it is a central human concern, and why it particularly matters today. This is the plan for the lecture today. What does flourishing mean?
그 이제 그 진실된 삶이 무엇인가?
Why is it the central
왜
human concern?
그것이 우리가 가져야 될 가장 중요한 관심인가?
And why and how it particularly matters today.
네, 그게 이제 왜 또 어떻게 오늘날 같은 문맥에서 그것이 중요한가? 이제 세 가지 주제를 오늘 강의를 할 것입니다.
And so I'll pick up the lecture from the first part. In here I'll do the reading. Right? Yeah, so the first part we'll skip.
지금 여기 저 영상 돌리시는 분께 마이플러시의 넘버 1인데 이게 표시가 안 돼서
예,
그게 슬라이드로 따지면 많이 넘어갈 겁니다. 한 6개, 7개 넘어갈 건데 시작하는 게 마이 플러리싱 라이프로 시작합니다. 가지겠어요.
I think I only have to hold it like this because it's a little bit too far and the script is too small. Okay. By flourishing life, we mean the good toward which human beings are meant to strive. It names not so much any number of things that we desire, but the ultimate goal of our striving, along with the tables of values which determine what is truly worth desiring. We use it more or less interchangeably with the true life, the good life, life worth living, human fullness, life abundant, life that truly is life. There are many ways in which we can express this idea. And although the good life is a technical term of art in classical philosophy and in Christian theology, we prefer the title flourishing life because it is clearly universal in scope, including the flourishing of creation, and avoids popular images of the good life, which is connected with extravagant consumption. Granted, flourishing can also conjure visions of life aloof from hardship and injustice, so we will sometimes use the term true life to make space for hard, arduous forms of life worth living can take under the conditions of present life, under the condition prior to the arrival of God's new creation, under the conditions of sin. Each of these terms has its own intellectual pedigree in the broad tradition of reflection on human nature, destiny, and place in the world. For us, the Christian faith decisively shapes the character of the flourishing life. Now, visions of flourishing are sometimes like vivid images we see and can describe to ourselves and others. Maybe like the Garden of Eden or the New Jerusalem. But mostly they are like a lens through which we see everything, the tacit background against which we live our lives, as Charles Taylor put it. If they are only implicit, we need to tease them out, make them explicit. In either case, it is our human responsibility to reflect on their function, their origin, content, and existential or intellectual adequacy, because they define our world and our very selves. We can switch from one vision to another, but if we do so in reality and not just in our imagination, we become a new person. We come to experience ourselves and our world in a different way, and our lives, in a sense, take a new turn. Now, for much of humans' early history, human beings saw their ultimate good in certain natural forms of well-being, in health, in wealth, in fertility, and longevity, generally what goes today under the title prosperity gospel. Health, wealth, fertility, and longevity. During what some philosophers and sociologists have described as axial transformations, a sense of inadequacy of such natural accounts of human flourishing crystallized. Today's world religions emerged out of these transformations. Each stands for an alternative idea that the ultimate good consists in forms of natural well-being. They all, each in its own way, distinguish between mundane and transcendent realms, and they all, again each in their own way, claim that the ultimate good consists in alignment of the self and society with the transcendent order. At the heart of the great world religions lies an answer to the question of true life, good life, genuinely flourishing life. Now, world religions provide the most enduring, most widespread, and arguably still most potent visions of human flourishing. But religions are not the only source of such visions. For many great philosophers, an articulation of the good life is a central concern. Either it is a pivot around which their philosophies turn, or an indispensable theme of their philosophies. This is true, for instance, of Socrates and Plato, Aristotle and Spinoza, Hume, Kant, Mill, Nietzsche. You can name many of philosophers of this sort. In recent centuries, some philosophers have come to advocate what might be described as modern and secular version of the pre-axial account of human good as natural well-being. Nietzsche might be the most radical among them, as he contests all forms of distinction between mundane and transcendent realms. Whether the distinction is drawn between sensible and supersensible worlds, as in Plato and monotheist religions, for instance, or within the world itself, as in Karl Marx and some forms of secular humanism. Still, he too had a vision of the kinds of human beings he wanted to see bred or raised. Though the world's religions and philosophers offer a diverse vision of the flourishing life, these visions we propose share three formal features. Flourishing life has a tripartite structure. Each world religion or philosophy gives an account of life going well, life being led well, and life feeling as it should. Life going well refers to the circumstantial dimension of the flourishing life, to the desirable circumstances of life be they natural, like fertile, uncontaminated land, or social, like a just political order, or even a good reputation, or personal, like health and longevity. Life led well refers to agential dimension of flourishing life, to the good conduct of life, from right thoughts of the heart and right acts to right habits and virtues. Life feeling as it should is about affective dimension of flourishing life, about states of happiness like contentment and joy and empathy. Each of the three features has its own integrity, but each is not like a leg of some good life stool bearing separately the weight. Instead, each also is tied to the other two, both influencing them and being influenced by them. So this then is what we mean by a vision of flourishing life. A set of explicit or implicit convictions about what it means for us to lead life well, for life to go well, and to feel right, convictions that guide or should guide all our desires and efforts. In the Christian faith, centered as it is on divine word become flesh in Jesus Christ as the true life and light of the world, Christian faith is such a vision, or rather, it is a large and quarrelsome family of such visions. Christian theology ought to be above all about critically discerning, articulating, and commending this vision. With this goal, theologians ought to enter the centuries-long and global conversation in which religious and unreligious thinkers wrestle about the most important human question. What is the true flourishing life, and how can we live it? But why? Aren't there other issues we ought to attend to, both more pressing and perhaps more manageable than this biggest of the big questions, like various forms of exclusion or exploitation? Can't we just assume a Christian vision of flourishing is given and go on with the endeavor of living it? Now, some people dismiss the exploration of good life as a luxury, a matter of maybe extra credit which we can take up if we are so inclined, and after the necessities of life, like food or shelter or safety, have been secured, and secured for all people. It is a mistake, however, to suppose that the satisfaction of basic needs can be separated from the meaning and goodness of life. Basic needs are famously difficult to pin down. Beyond the resources human beings require as biological organisms, the very determination of what constitutes a basic human need depends not just on the social standing of a person, but decisively also on the kind of life we find worth desiring. Moreover, cultural, economic, and political struggle against deprivation and oppression will fail if a positive vision of flourishing life does not guide it. That's why, according to the Gospels, Jesus didn't just feed the poor and heal the sick, although he did that. He called them to reorient their entire life around seeking God and God's righteousness. I believe that we insult the humanity of languishing when we suggest that the concern with the basic character and direction of their lives is somehow beyond their reach, that they have to progress on the hierarchy of needs, from food, shelter, to safety, to community, to self-esteem, to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, until finally they are capable of reflecting on the meaning and puzzling out the shape of the true life. An 8-year-old girl getting up before dawn to take the one family cow to pasture before going to school, which is, I'm referring here to my mother, can ask no less that question as can respected scientists working in industry. Those racked with pain because of illness, suffering under yoke of oppression, or worrying about their next meal need visions of human fullness at least as much as sometimes more than those who are healthy, unconstrained, and well-fed. Many of those who formulated great ancient visions of human flourishing, as well as the vast majority of those who embraced them through the centuries, lived in circumstances most people in economically developed countries today would describe as dire. Suffering of one kind or another, and the indignities that accompanied have been historically and continue to be presently the main motor for both the search for a vision of life that is truly worthy human beings and for the struggle, personal and social, to turn that vision into reality. Sometimes I want to say that it's actually people who are well off that push aside the question of the good life, and those who are more impoverished are likely to take it up. A compelling vision of flourishing life is not a luxury, a cozy reading room for a middle-class home which already has a kitchen, bedroom, living space, and bedrooms. It is a basic need for a being who does not and cannot live by bread alone. All human beings, in all cultures, each in their own way, aspire to genuine flourishing, their own and that of those for whom they care. First, we are inescapably oriented toward some good, toward things, states of affairs, practices, and emotions we perceive as good. Second, we are reflective and moral beings. We want to know that the good toward which we are striving is, in fact, desirable. Finally, aware as we are of living in time, we gather our past in memory and future in anticipation, and want to be assured of the goodness or rightness of our whole life. Unless the speed and noise of life are unrelenting, we will occasionally survey our life, past, present, and future, and ask what would it mean for the entirety of it to be good. Truly flourishing life is the most important concern of our lives, the pearl for which it is worth selling everything else we might have, wealth, power, fame, or pleasure. With that pearl, we receive back improved the kinds of things we've sold to acquire it. Without that pearl, we ourselves are diminished and lost, and none of the things we refuse to sell in order to acquire it can make up for the damage. But like swine of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, many of us, ordinary people and intellectuals alike, and especially in the affluent West, we trample that pearl under our feet, seeing in it nothing fit to satisfy our wayward hunger. Today, more than in any previous time in history, the character of flourishing life is a pressing concern. Though the issue is ancient, as we have seen, we now ask it and have to answer it in a new way. In ages past, as in some traditional cultures today, a vision of good life was largely inscribed into the objective conditions of lived lives, in the perceived givenness of the cosmic and social orders, in accepted religious rituals and traditions, in ways in which communities engaged in cultural, economic, and political reproduction of life. Even individuals' vocations were mostly passed from mother to daughter and from father to son. Even when a person needs to discern the specific shape of their particular life, but most Oh, sorry, something's wrong here. In any case, most people, even when people needed to discern specific shapes of their lives, most people believe that the ultimate goal and the tables of value from which that particular shape gained significance was pre-given, perhaps even natural. For a large and increasing portion of the world's population, this is no longer the case. In culture shaped by modernity, we have come to live disembedded lives, to use a phrase of Charles Taylor. No longer experiencing ourselves as constituents of meaningful cosmos and members of a social body, we modern human beings perceive ourselves and act first and foremost as individuals, sovereign owners of ourselves and our actions. We can no longer read off meaning from our social and cosmic locations. Nothing has claim to our allegiance until we first choose to give it our allegiance. We live under what many years ago Peter Berger, a sociologist, has described as a heretical imperative. We are not just free to choose, we are forced to do so. As a consequence, what counts as flourishing life and what it means specifically for each to flourish require from us intentional deliberation. As we will see shortly, we tend not to spend much time on the matter, but either simply float along in a lazy river or paddle madly in the boulder-riddled rapids to beat others to the finish line. Still, we float and we paddle in a cultural river with many currents and crossed currents. When we become reflective about our lives, we must contend with those diverse currents and are forced to choose and reconfirm the choices we have made. Even a birth into a rich tradition that initially defined the flourishing life for us doesn't relieve us from the choice. Instead of simply taking on and living out a preset vision of flourishing, perhaps struggling but failing to live or chafing against it, we are pushed to engage always afresh the question, which life is, in fact, good? Now, let's remind ourselves what is the nature of the choice we are talking about here. To choose here is not so much to pick one among many of more or less desirable things. It is to opt for the direction of our entire life, either to confirm the course we are on, and which we enact without much thought in the myriad of daily choices we make, or to change the course of our lives. Put more abstractly, we are deciding among the candidates for the character and purpose of our lives and for reflexive standards by which we evaluate our ordinary choices. We are deciding about what kind of human being is it worth being and what kind of world is it worth inhabiting. For a century and a half or so, many in the West were convinced that when it comes to vision of flourishing life, the main choice was between some form of religious faith and secularism. Secularism seemed to be winning, in fact, but the situation has proven to be more complicated. Globally, religions, particularly Buddhism, Christianity and Islam, continue to grow in absolute and relative terms, shape the private and public lives of billions, and spread throughout the world. For most people today, the choice is not between religious faith or lack of it. It is among many forms of religious faith and our religious philosophies of life. Multiple visions of flourishing life, mutually contending through though rarely completely incompatible, and each explicitly or implicitly claiming to stand for the true life, all of them vie for our allegiance. We are choosing in a post-secular and pluralistic world. Free to choose, and at the same time saddled with necessity of doing so, we are also faced with the choice between meaningful life and life bereft of meaning. Many of those who see themselves as living in the long shadow of what Nietzsche called the death of God embrace the idea, either with resignation or courage, that they can give no better reason for their basic choices than their preference itself. But to choose something just because we want is to empty our choice of significance. Any meaning that we give, we can take away as well. Any choice that we make then seems as good as any other. In some version of the world in which preferences are kings and queens, religious choices become as good as irreligious ones, and life cannot be rescued from threat of arbitrariness. The possibility of meaninglessness too, and not just multiple offers of visions of true and meaningful life, keep us searching and choosing.